All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is our final IntEnt workshop, which is focused on building a virtuous culture. Let me quickly go over our purpose and mission. IntEnt is a Boston College graduate student organization providing mentorship, experiential learning, and collaborative resources to BC graduate entrepreneurs. Our mission is to develop, train, support, and inspire a community of entrepreneurial and intrapreneurial leaders grounded by Jesuit principles and dedicated to act ethically and altruistically in the world. I couldn't have thought of a better way to end our academic year. We are hosting this talk, and our speakers are Bill Bowman and Peter Pinn. They've spent a lot of time being leaders and also teaching leadership. So I can't be more thankful for them to be here and share their insights into leadership. Bill and Peter, would you like to start with a bit of introduction on your part?
Great,
Sure.
Thank you, Vishal. Bill, please go ahead.
Okay, can you control the screen, Peter, or no?
Yeah, do you want something up?
No, this is fine. I just wanted to know that we could get there. Okay, great. Well, we're delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I think what we'd like to cover today is Catholic social doctrine and business. No, not many people really think those two things go together, but we like to show you how they do. So we'll cover the first question, what is Catholic social doctrine? And then get into two mini cases. One, Wegmans, the grocery chain, and the second one is Coca-Cola Consolidated, one of Coke's bottlers, their biggest bottler, and really look at it from the perspective of those companies. But first, just a brief introduction for myself. I've spent most of my career in business as an entrepreneur. I started 2 software companies up in Boston and a private girls' school in Medfield up in Boston. And I've acted as CEO or president for over 25 years in various private companies across the country. An event in 2001 really changed my perspective on all of this. And in that year, of course, that was also the Twin Towers disaster. But in that year, one of the fastest growing companies in the country completely collapsed. This is Enron, a energy trading company, totally collapsed, $63 billion bankruptcy, the biggest one ever, wiping out the portfolios of all of their employees and, of course, all of their investors. The principals, the CEO and the CFO went to jail and were found guilty of massive accounting fraud. The bankruptcy devastated all of the Enron employees. They were urged to really just have one stock in their portfolio, and that was Enron stock. And their families were really impacted, of course, but it extended to the entire Houston area and to the entire energy field. Well, shortly after this, I got a call from a priest friend of mine who basically challenged me, and he said, "Why are so many Catholic business people involved in corruption?" And I said, "Gosh, I really don't know." He said, "Well, why don't you go read Rerum Novarum?" And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, this is the first social encyclical of the Catholic Church written by Pope Leo XIII. And since then, many others have been written, but you really would benefit from reading this because it really is the first encyclical that even talks about business, capital, and labor, of course." And so I did. I had no idea up at that point that the church had anything really to say about business, but I went and read that encyclical and really found it fascinating, and then read the other 8 that were out at the time. There are about 8 or 9 of these social encyclicals. And I started giving speeches across the country on this topic. From a business person's perspective, what does the Catholic Church have to say about business? So that's been my focus for the past few years, and I'm learning a lot still and have a lot more to say about this, but I'll turn it over to Peter and he can introduce himself. I think you're muted, Peter.
Peter, you're mute.
That would be helpful. So maybe I'll tell you a different story approach of how I started with my introduction to a virtuous culture, which we'll be talking about tonight. And while Bill was looking at the destruction of a company called Enron, I was inside a company called WorldCom, which then went on to be the largest bankruptcy in the history of the country as well, right around that same time. So I was living the ultimate nightmare, and I wouldn't call that a dream. But let me take you back a minute to when I first was introduced to business, virtues in business. I was 12 years old, and I had the best job as a 12-year-old. I was cutting lawns, and I was showing up at somebody's house who had a riding mower, this big mower with a steering wheel, and it was the perfect job. I had a nice slope on this hill, and I would cut this lawn, get paid, and go home. One day I'm cutting this lawn, and I run over something big. I don't even know what it was, but it just killed the lawnmower. And so I push this thing up the hill into the garage, look around, and then leave. Don't say anything. Don't tell anybody anything. The next day I get this call from the owner, and he says, "Hey, how did things go?" And he goes, I said, "Oh, they went fine." He goes, "Really?" He goes, "No problems?" I said, "No, everything's fine." He goes, "Well, you know, my neighbor was looking out the window watching you cut the grass yesterday, and of course saw the whole thing." And so here I have my first job. I've completely fallen apart with the virtues. My honesty, gone. Integrity, gone. Courage to do the right thing, gone. So little did I know that having failed at virtues at an early age, I would one day be working and teaching about it. Well, the good thing about virtues, and that we'll learn, is that in culture is that it's learned. It is truly something that can be learned. Now, you know, it's better if you start learning these things at 10 or 12, okay? But all organizations really can build virtue into their cultures, into their employees, and they don't have just 12-year-olds. So I went on to work in the international field in Latin America in the telecommunications industry. And there wasn't a week that went by where you were confronted with something ethical or moral that you had to grapple with. And, you know, having virtues as a foundation is truly what made some of that, you know, livable, because you really need this foundation. And so if you're building a culture in an organization, you want to build it on the right things. Well, how do you do that? We'll talk about that. And so a few years ago, I retired from Verizon. Bill and I started this. I began teaching as well. And we started a human rights organization 2 years ago. And so we've done a lot. We've enjoyed it. But really, our passion is to really bring virtues into that operating model of businesses. And that's what we're doing. So with that, we want to do a couple things tonight. And let's share the screen here. Because what we'll do is we wanted to start with the case for Wegmans. Now, has everybody read the case? Let me get to where we're. I guess that would be the first. Well, let me give me a second here, get back to my. Nope, that's not where we want to go. Then I'm looking for our agenda, which I might have to pop up. Hold on 1 second here. Or Bill, can you pop up the document?
No, it's really the Wall Street Journal article that we're looking for.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
So you should have that in that.
Yeah. Hold on 1 second, and we'll bring that up.
If in case it doesn't work, I also have it on my screen, and I can share and help assist sharing it as well.
No, we're good. We're good. We should be able to bring it up here.
Okay.
Okay. So what I'll do, let me just share that screen again. Go back to that. Get us all on the same sheet of music. So am I sharing now?
Not yet.
No. Let's push this button.
Yep.
All right, here we go.
Okay.
All right. So Bill, we're going to start with the Catholic social doctrine to lay the foundation of what it looks like as we turn to businesses.
So this was a letter to the editor that I wrote to the journal that they published in February. I just thought, they're writing about these things, they're beginning to write about these things. Maybe I can help set up a structure for them to think about business and Catholic social doctrine, and they did. So they published the letter, and essentially, if you haven't seen this, maybe we'll just take 30 seconds so you can scan it. Okay, Peter, if you can move down a little bit lower. So essentially, Catholic social doctrine has 4 important pillars. The first is, and most important, is the dignity of the human person. Then something called solidarity, something called subsidiarity, and then the common good. The Catholic Church has wonderful insights, but they are horrible marketers. So these words really don't mean much to most people. So if we go down a little bit further, we can begin to ask, okay, how do each of these pillars intersect with the business world? So first, the dignity of the human person. I'll just go up a little bit there, Peter. The key message there is that our dignity comes from being children of God. And I was kind of surprised that's a term I used in that letter, and the journal went ahead and printed it, because this is actually something that people are beginning to think about. John Paul II said, God made work for man, not man for work. And that's really quite a flip of what most people think. We see our employees as sort of agents to get things done. And what the Pope is really saying here is that God made work for man, that this is really how he would become holy and how he would, provide for his family and everything else. So it's just completely turned around 180 degrees. But the question becomes, if success is measured in people terms, how do you do that? How do you actually measure success in people terms, not in financial terms? Financial metrics are simple, they're well-defined, we understand them. But what are some metrics? Can any of you think of metrics that really measure people and their affinity to a business?
And I'm hoping, Vishal, and especially from your leadership program, are you addressing issues like this particular one? Has there been discussion about how we measure success in terms of people?
Not so much, but we had briefly talked about happiness index. I believe it was last class that we had spoken about, and how people find this sense of fulfillment through the work that they do. But it hasn't been a major part of our discussion in our leadership class.
But that's a great insight. I think, most people have a sense that happiness is really the ultimate measure of one's life. And if we can begin to help executives think about how to measure happiness, of course, we've been trying to do that for a long time, but there probably are some concrete ways. And I think that might be a very interesting area for more research and more thinking. So thank you, that's very helpful. The second, solidarity. And when we think about solidarity, it's useful to think about all the stakeholders. Of course, there's a lot of discussion about stakeholders because of the business council, took a look at the way that they were measuring their work. And they said before, companies really should just maximize shareholder value. That famous article that was done maybe 30 or 40 years ago by Milton Friedman. But they said, no, let's take a look at all the stakeholders. And of course, that's how most people run their business, is looking at all of the people involved in the business. So that would include, there are 5 of them: employees, customers, suppliers, investors, and members of the community. And so as an executive interested in applying these principles of Catholic social doctrine, it would be important to really see if you can live solidarity better by helping members of these 5 different groups of people involved in your business to lead a better life. Perhaps you could look at your suppliers and say, maybe we don't have to get the last nickel out of our suppliers. Let's sit down together and see if we can really figure out a way that we mutually benefit from some changes we make to the business relationship between us. So that's really the question. Is there a way that a business could live solidarity with a competitor? Not many try that. We have competition and words like that. But I think the challenge is there some way that we could really live solidarity with a competitor? We're pretty sure that there probably are some ways of collaboration that increase the pot for everyone. And looking at those and trying to study those and think about those certainly would be helping to increase the solidarity index, if you will, looking at these 5 different stakeholder groups. Let's go down a little bit.
Hey, Bill, let me throw out there, just so you're thinking, and we're going to be talking about Wegmans, which is a supermarket, but yet, the way that a company can live solidarity is their competitors are obviously not going to give competitive intelligence to their competing companies, but they can find a common ground to live this principle of solidarity. And that is, if an example would be if they both end up at the end of the day with food that has to be either thrown out or donated or something. But if they collectively have a network designed to take that at the end of the day and distribute it in an even way to reach the most people, that would be collaboration by 2 very competitive companies, but for more of this common good. So that would be an example of what you wouldn't naturally think of 2 companies coming together, working together, and yet they can.
Sure. I think that's a good example. Can we go down to the next? So the third one is subsidiarity, which is a horrible word. No one knows what that means. But basically, it's a simple concept. And that's that you, as an executive in your company, delegate responsibility and decision-making authority down to the lowest level you can in your organization, as long as the people making those decisions are competent to make the decisions. There's always a tendency, and certainly I think the biggest violator of subsidiarity is probably the government, because they just tend to think that they can be involved in, should be involved in everything. And but another example might be a CEO who decided that he or she was going to just rearrange the cubicles on the 4th floor. Well, certainly the people that sit in those cubicles are far better, are the right people to ask about how that should be done. And a CEO imposing his or her will would be a real violation of this principle. The other nice thing about subsidiarity is, when it's lived well, is that it just helps a company to delayer. You can just basically cut layers out of a company. You're taking, since the person who should be making the decision is fairly low in the organization, suddenly that person has the right to go ahead and say, let's do it this way or let's do it that way. And that permits the organization to really cut layers. We won't have time to talk about Nucor Steel tonight, but Nucor is one of my favorite examples of a company that there was no religious motivation for this at all. They just decided that this is the best way to run their company, and they have just wonderful examples of all 4 of these principles within their company. And the one on subsidiarity is they've just from the start have said, hey, we only have 3 levels in this company. We have the CEO, we have the people that run the plants, and then we have everybody else. And it's really astonishing how much money they saved by reducing the cost structure. And they were able to do that because they really took after this concept of subsidiarity.
So,
and then,
Bill, one of the things, even if you look at an organization like the military, where you would think because of the concept of unity of command, they need to have decisions that flow rapidly, quickly, and are made in a way that benefit the organization. And so having a hierarchical structure sometimes can be beneficial. But even the military pushes down
sure,
that ability to delegate and have the authority to make decisions at a very low level, especially when the troops are in the field. So even in a structured environment like that the concept truly can apply.
Yep, great point. And then finally, the common good. And the question there are we stewards, good stewards of the wealth that our businesses create? And, if we look at what is that wealth that our businesses create, let's call it excess wealth, if you will. And that's the amount that's left over after we've, paid for all the product components, paid for salaries and bonuses, put money into a CapEx fund to fund our expansion, and have a reasonable financial return to investors. If that return is unreasonable, I don't say unreasonable, but if it's enormous, way out of line, well, that's when we really get into this interesting issue of what does God really intend for this? And under the principle of the common good, he is really saying, well, I'm the owner of all of this, and there are people that are suffering, and I would much prefer that you take care of them than just consume that yourself. A lot of business people have a lot of trouble with this, and I think this is probably one that we have to study some more and describe in a good way. But that's the whole theory of that common good, is that really God is in charge of all of this, and we should, as business people, try and figure out how we live that without saying all of the money belongs to the shareholders. Not a popular position, I'll tell you, but it is the one that
Hey, Bill?
describe this. Yes.
Yeah, so is there any good examples of those who, after paying salaries and bonuses, and the shareholders, what they have left? I mean, normally that pie is small. They've kind of like spread it out
Sure.
to many different elements. But is there like a metric, like you shouldn't get more than like 10%, for this, the thing, or, it'd be interesting to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Sure. I don't think there is one. I don't think many people have really worried too much about this. They just tend to say this belongs to the shareholders and they grab it. Where you see people practicing this is in family businesses. And, they're really members of the community. They know exactly who the people who are suffering. And I was doing some work for a company up in Boston, and they said, we really do want to live this. And we had a great year. And that's usually the beginning of the conversation. And, we feel that we've got about, $18,000 that we could contribute back. Then the question becomes, how should that be distributed? Some people say, just give it back to the shareholders proportionately. But that isn't really the spirit of this. The spirit of this is much more that the company itself would get everyone together and talk through this and then decide, where is this money going to go? Who really needs it the most? And what they decided was, who knows the most about that is the parish priest. They know everything about the people that are suffering. They have all the folks coming for handouts and things like that. They have no overhead. So it's kind of an ideal way to distribute excess cash, if you will. But no, I don't know any big companies that are doing that at all. The shareholder pressure is just too great.
But Vishal, you're seeing a lot of companies talk about that. If they have 5 pillars that they want to, address now, the customer, the shareholder, the employee, the community, the supplier, that issue is getting raised. But I think we need to do more work on how it translates into, more of that community effort for the common good.
So I think there has been a slight change in the way companies are conducting themselves, especially because of the rise of activist investors and activist shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that kind of influence that has been seen in the last decade is changing companies' mindset. I do agree, big companies like, not to take names, but like even Apple, they really, save their cash offshore to be able to get taxed on it. So to expect them to redistribute that excess wealth within our own community is something that seems far-fetched at the moment. But I wonder if activist investors could have influence moving forward.
I think they will.
Yeah, they might. I think what's more likely to happen is that things like B corporations, which are kind of being set up right now to sort of acknowledge the fact that there's something other than pure financial return. And setting up a B Corp, you can say, look, we're kind of protecting this amount. This is going to be sort of our charitable area, if you will. and the rest of the money will go into the regular corporation and its shareholders. So have you guys done much work with B Corps at all?
No, we generally focus on startups.
Okay, yeah, startups could be B Corps as well. You're right, that's a little bit more unusual because the venture capitalists are very interested in getting a return without having some of it bleed off. So
right, but most of the B Corps are smaller, started out as smaller organizations, though.
True.
yeah, I just don't know when they kind of.
But if you asked 25 people if they know anything about B Corps and would they buy from a B Corp versus one that's not, I'm not sure how many would really know that.
Sure.
Okay. I have a quick follow-up question as well. We as humans are driven by incentives in some form or the other, especially the incentives that are measurable, that have some form of metrics to them. When it comes to common goods, I feel like it's a meta belief, it's a something meta that sometimes can be incomprehensible because it cannot be measured. So if we were to lead people to really think about virtuous leadership, and to have them think about what could be the immediate incentives for them to live this virtual leadership life, what could we suggest them? How could we have them see the unseeable short-term and long-term incentives for adopting this common good mindset?
Well, I think we'll get into looking at the U.S. Inspect case, and in general, I think the examples of the companies that we're going to talk about are that their financial performance was really improved when they actually made some of these changes. And that's, of course, the most beautiful thing. If you can live these principles and really be true to them, and yet also improve your financial performance, well, that's an obvious win-win. And I think that may be more of the way to look at these companies like a Wegmans that has twice the gross margin of a Stop and Shop, and really begin to understand what is going on in these companies. How are they getting this superb financial performance? And as you dig down, you find out that a lot of it ties back to these 4 principles.
Well, so if we have about 15 minutes, so I'd like to go to the Wegmans case.
Sure.
Now, I don't know if everybody's read it. If they've read it, we don't have to reread it. But if not, we could take maybe 3 minutes to read it. Would that be the better thing to do, to read it real quick?
Let's ask everyone. I mean, audience, have you read the case? Have you had a chance to read the case, or would you like to read the case for 3 minutes before we move forward?
Vishal, I've read it.
Okay. So maybe we can move forward in the interest of time.
Sure.
And then folks who have not been able to read it before can go back to it, read it, and be able to make those, connect those points.
Great. Well, what I could do is summarize sort of where Wegmans was, and then we'll get to some of these questions here that we want to ask. So just to give you sort of an idea of this company, 3 years ago, they were rated by I think it was Fortune or Forbes as the #2 best company in the country to work for. This is a supermarket, right? #1 at the time was Google. And so they are not your typical supermarket, and clearly have done something different. And one of the things that has come out is that they, going back to that common good, is that they really empower their employees to do things that most, not only grocery stores, but other companies just don't do. And the ultimate sort of result of this is that they have very, very happy, fulfilled employees. And so when you're asking, Vishal, about how do we measure this, or how do we, track that, it's hard. How do you measure happiness in a company, right? From just a happiness standpoint. And yet, clearly, the results reflect this in a way that maybe is not so tangible. It's not like a 30% increase in profit and a 20% increase in happiness. So I think there's a little bit of, measuring that has to be done maybe in a different way than the way we would measure finances, right? But no less valuable. So at a high level, what Wegmans did is they really believed that if we were able to take care of our customers, if we could take care of our employees first, we would then be able to take care of our customers. And so their focus is to make their employees so empowered and so well-rounded that that would carry through the organization, ultimately to the customer, and ultimately to the bottom line. And it did. And in an industry where sometimes this industry, you may see 100% turnover in their staff, certainly the part-time, in a year, right? But even the full-time employees, their turnover rates are a third of what the industry has. So clearly the things that we're going to talk about that they're doing are powerful. And they are absolutely tied to Catholic social doctrine and the human virtues. And one of those real powerful ones that they've done is that concept of solidarity, okay? So, or subsidiarity. So the ability to push down decision-making to the lowest level is the concept of subsidiarity. And an example that Wegmans had was their motto was the employee at any level is fully empowered to make sure that a customer does not leave the store unhappy, right? And so he does not have to check with his supervisor to do what it takes to make him happy. And so that's a complete empowerment at the very lowest level of an organization that impacts their customers in a very big way. And when you looked at what they did is they created 15 and 16-year-olds that had input into the organization in a meaningful way. Well, if you're 15 or 16 years old and you're working for a supermarket, that's not really your typical great job to have, much less have any say in what goes on. Well, they do that. And once they begin doing that, these employees become hooked for life, if you will, and they love it. They love the fact that they have a voice. I just had a meeting with a guy today, a friend of mine who runs capture for a large, systems integrator here in the DC area. And the one thing he said why he's leaving the business is this company is that, and he's really an incredible guy, brilliant, but his voice isn't being heard. They're not listening to me. And I have all these great ideas and these things that clearly would impact their bottom line because this is my expertise, and no one's listening. And that's not happening at Wegmans. At Wegmans, they listen from the very bottom all the way to the top. So it creates this culture that is very different than other supermarkets. So having said that, just a little bit overview of the company. Bill, did you want to add anything or just get right into some of these questions?
Well, I think, we can scan the questions quickly and just see if we can move on to the next point too. But I think you summarized it really well. They are just, Bob Wegman is Catholic. They live up in northern part of New York. And they started this, with all the good altruistic reasons as well. And it's just, they have just a beautiful view of the dignity of the human person, and that dignity can extend to places that most other stores just don't bother, those 16-year-olds and so forth. And anyway, that's, right. It's an incredible company. I think there's one up in Boston, right? You got them up there now? I think there's one. I'm pretty sure there's some up there.
I've heard of Wegmans. I've never gone in one myself, but I've.
There's one in Burlington, Massachusetts. Yes.
I've been to the one in Burlington.
Yeah.
It's a really, really well-run shop.
When you throw out there from a business standpoint, this bullet on number 2 is that how many times do you hear from a company or that you've worked for or dealt with that we put our customers first? It's almost across the board. That is what companies do. But Wegmans says we put our employees first, and the flow down will take care of the customers. And so that's a very different perspective as an employee when you're working for a company. Now, the end result is that the customer is always taken care of, because by taking care of their employees, it flows down. But you don't hear anybody say, we take, our employees come first. It just doesn't ring right, right? So we have to look at the way we're doing things and say, well, is there a different way to achieve the same result that we want by doing something differently. And the introduction of these doctrines and these virtues that the way Wegmans has done is one of those kind of success stories that clearly proves that it happens and can happen and have a very happy employee base. So,
and a fantastic set of financial results, just unbelievable. You know, they're almost double the dollars per square foot. Their operating margins, as I mentioned, are twice the industry average. So there's a real payout to doing this right, and Wegmans can show us what that is.
Right, and consequently, the salaries are higher than the industry, right? So that's another benefit for that employee. So Bill, I think what we can do is, why don't we just talk about another company real quick, because we could spend about 2 hours on Wegmans, but I
Sure.
think the story of Coca-Cola is as powerful and really shakes your thinking about what companies can do in this day and age.
Great. So Coca-Cola Consolidated is the largest Coca-Cola bottler. The way Coke works is in Atlanta, they have their headquarters, and that's where the recipe is for the secret sauce, the secret syrup that goes into all Coca-Cola products. So all they sell is the syrup. The rest of the country is covered by bottlers, and Coca-Cola Consolidated is the largest of those bottlers. What's really interesting with this company is that it's run by a very serious evangelical. And he said, you know what, our purpose is to honor God in all we do. And he said, I'm going to put this up all over our factories and our bottling plants. And they've continued to grow, $5 billion in revenue. They're a public company, 17,000 employees. And everywhere you turn, they have this, you know, this message. Remember that our purpose is to honor God in all that we do. So they've not only just put up the signs, and that anybody can do that, but they've also established an infrastructure that supports that. 100 prayer groups across the consolidated shops, 86 pastors whose job it is to really work with the families and to help them with tough, you know, life issues, children who take drugs, infidelity, divorce, things like that. And so they are really, really different from the other bottling companies, and their financial performance has just been fantastic. But I think one of the key points here is that this, you know, 3 years ago, I would have looked at this and said, you can't do that. You can't put the word God in something for a public company. But the answer is you can do anything you want in these areas of religion, except one thing. And that is you can't point at someone and say, I will not hire you because you're Muslim. You know, that's a violation of the Constitution. But everything else is permitted. And they've litigated a lot of this themselves because they want to encourage other businesses to be very proactive in their promotion, their love, and their attitude towards God.
And Bill, clearly this is something, you know, the big movement in the last few years has been ERGs, the employee resource groups. And, you know, the ability for people to form prayer groups, right? Do things that really make them feel, if that's what makes them feel very comfortable and very, you know, part of this organization, that I'm allowed to pray, well, they can do that, right? And that's a movement that's been going on, but again, not all companies have those. But the legal hurdles have been cleared.
Yep. And they're just taking off. And it's very interesting. The companies that are really supporting ERGs and really, you know, getting their employees to pay attention are the high-tech Silicon Valley companies primarily. So you wouldn't think of that, but maybe it's because they just don't feel competent to do it themselves, but they are very supportive of these ERGs, of groups of, maybe it's, you know, maybe there's a gay rights one, maybe there's a Catholic one, there's, you know, one for Muslims oftentimes. But these are really beginning to take off right now. And it just makes the workplace much more comfortable.
So I think we are just sort of at the end of our time here. So we have about 2 minutes to talk about, to answer questions, and maybe, and I'll stop the sharing here so we can get pictures of everyone.
Good.
So sorry, Peter, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to open it up for questions or comments or challenges if you want.
So I have a quick question. So as you mentioned, some companies are reluctant to really implement some of these measures to introduce virtuous culture. And that's probably because religion has become a sensitive topic in our communities and in our
Right.
culture, and integrating people from who may be coming from different cultures and religions might not seem to be or basically having efforts pushed on them might not seem to be professional in the world that we live in now. And so I wanted to ask you, in order to basically democratize this process, how could a leader go about doing this? Maybe not necessarily coming from a religious standpoint, but also just focusing on the virtues that could come from one religion or could be a mix of several different religions.
Sure, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think virtues are the right way to proceed with that. We'll do that in the second session here today, but our company is really founded on that belief, and the work we've done with companies that this is a very easy way for them to get into something that looks a little bit more like what Coca-Cola has, but perhaps isn't as explicit. And so human virtues are a wonderful way, of course, to go back to way before Christ. So they're not tied to any one particular religion. But of course, the Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas, and other philosophers have done a phenomenal job of taking these virtues and really developing them and describing them. And we benefit from all of that, which is great.
Quick follow-up question. Should virtues be a part of core values, or should they be kept separate because they should mean something different for a corporate world?
Yeah, that's a big debate. I think that values are relative, and so they're difficult to kind of say, well, these are our values. Well, they're your values, and it may not be my values. Whereas virtues tend to be, after 2,000 years or 3,000 years, pretty well defined. And every virtue has a vice. So there's so you can look at either side of the coin, and that really helps you understand what this is, what this virtue means. So I think the fact that there's so much better definitions are so much better in the world of virtue, that's the term we prefer.
Our belief, Vishal, and I quoted this in this lecture on strategy earlier today, is that every sinner needs a virtue strategy. Well, our belief is every company needs a virtue strategy, right? Whether you're a sinner or not. So, for us, having a virtue strategy is really critical, right? And it does begin to address, the disparities that tend to take people away, come together, because virtues, like Bill said, are fairly universally described, right? We've listed 130 on our website, and there's probably more than that. But they're recognized, and people can come to agree on them. They don't have to. They could be of any faith. It doesn't really matter.
Right. That's all my question. Anyone else has any questions for our esteemed speakers?
I do. For this virtue that we were talking about, and the way that the leadership role happens in the companies towards the empowering of the employees, how important do you feel that in the hiring process there needs to be a diversity, equity, and inclusion process to be able to also identify those employees that are going to be able to accept this empowering process, but also acknowledging who they are with the diversity that they represent when they enter the corporation?
Oscar, are you asking that from an employee that's going to hire onto a company, or for the company that is interviewing to hire on the employee?
The company.
Okay.
Because I am a company, so I will want to know from the company perspective the diversity, equity, inclusion portion of it.
Okay.
That goes back to that first principle of the four, which is the dignity of the human person. Dignity of the human person requires you to have that kind of an attitude of inclusion, and it requires you to just be rid of any bias whatsoever, because every single person should be viewed as a child of God. So if you have, certain biases against people, it's just would be rejected by that first principle. And the more we can study about people's dignity, I think the better we'll be able to approach these issues.
And there's a real, there's real ways to hire that way, Oscar. So if you're looking for somebody that is of that mindset that you want somebody that's virtuous in these ways, there are real ways to look at being able to hire that person. And so it's absolutely valid, right? To be able to say, this is what we want. This is what my company wants to build, and this is how we're hiring our people. Question is, how do you figure that out sometimes? How do you, but there are absolutely ways. We talk actually a little more about it later tonight, but I'll be more than happy to share some of that with you at any time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, sorry, Jessica, please go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say thank you for coming to speak. I was a pretty last minute sign up, but I'm glad that I decided to join today. And I love the examples that you shared. One question I have is, so I currently work in a large corporation and my role isn't in management or leadership yet. Do you have any recommendations on how someone in my position could try to manage up or influence the business or operations to be more virtuous? Like, I know my day-to-day role, I could treat people with dignity and treat everyone with kindness, but how could I influence the rest of the company to do that?
Well, a friend of mine asked that same question. He worked for a very large company, defense contractor here in DC. And he said, look, I can't change this. What can I do? And I said, well, do you have employees who report to you or that, you work right alongside? And he said, yes. We kind of looked at how many there were. And then we said, well, why don't you go ahead and do this program that we would do usually with a very large company, but it can scale down. And so he went out, and the question is, what virtues are really important to the customers of this company? Well, the customers of this little group were internal customers. The HR is the customer with other people, and they defined all of that. And then they picked 5 virtues, which is what our program basically suggests. And they all trained on those 5 virtues. And they created such a wonderful atmosphere in that particular department that other people started, saying, hey, I'd like to work over here. And the CEO noticed that, and he came down and he said, what are you doing? How did you get such loyalty from these people and get their, they're excited about work? And he explained it. And then he said, we're all going to learn about this. And he invited all of his managers in for a 2-hour presentation on this.
And Jessica, the same thing happened to my organization as well. When we were part of Verizon, right? It's a $130 billion company. Our segment was about $3 billion, and mine was $1 billion. Small for Verizon, but big enough. But when we did programs and we had the autonomy to do them, and they were very successful, and it flowed down to our numbers. Part of it was people liked working there, right? So from the get-go, the retention numbers were great. The costs were down, and eventually, the upper management notices and says, hey, what are you doing over there? Why is it so successful? They don't always embrace it entirely, or sometimes they do, but it was worth it just to do it for my own team to be successful with that team. And so don't hesitate to start it right there. Whether somebody embraces it above you or not, it remains to be seen, and there's ways to maybe communicate that up. But I would encourage you to start a program now, right? And the results will show. They will show. People will be, they'll see the people are different over there. Why are they different? What are you doing over there, Jessica?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both.